Welcome to the tutorial for the Netherfield dress. So I'm going to start with the chest pocket. This is optional, obviously. You could do one or two. I prefer to do one. So I'm just going to be doing one today. This is my pattern piece. Let's unpin it. Remember to cut the correct size for your dress that you're making. So I'm folding on the fold line, right sides together. And then I'm going to fold up the centimetre seam allowance as well. I'm just going to give that a little press before I stitch it. So there we go, that's it. That's the 1 centimetre and the fold line. And then I'm just going to use my 1 centimetre seam allowance to bag out these little corner bits. There we go. That's my centimetre. Oh, a little bit of nesting there. Let's just trim away some of this. And we'll clip the corners and just grade that little piece on the side seams. Just reducing the bulk a little bit. I'll do that on both sides. Incidentally, this fabric I'm using was gifted to me by Minerva, and it's called Looping Light. It's part of their core range. It's a viscose linen mix, and it's really, really lovely actually. So let's poke these corners out gently so that we've got those corners bagged out. Great. And then I'm just going to press that again, and I'll press up the other seam allowance as well while I'm there, look, just so it's all neat. And I'm going to stitch across here once just to hold that fold down. Okay, that's our little pocket done. So it just needs a few little bits of fabric. There we go. Just get rid of that. Pocket done. Okay, so next we're going to do the darts, which are on the front bodice. Here's my front piece. It's a pair of these. It's got a seam at the front, so you've got notches along the front seam as well. And your underarm, I've marked my dart and my pocket placement in a coloured pen so that I know I've got the correct size, very clearly marked, and I've just transferred those markings directly onto my fabric so it shows up for you. This is your length and shorten line. You've got your grain line. This is also a suggested length if you want a tunic length. Again, I don't know what your body length is and things, so you'll need to check that against yourself. But first I'm going to mark with a pin the end of the dart here. I've put snips at the broad end as I normally do. Let's put that pin in properly so I don't lose it. And then I'm going to find those little snips that I've done at the broad end, put those together so it's right sides together again. Find the pin, which is the point of the dart. Fold that over nicely, and I'm going to stitch from the broad end, back tack, and taper off towards the pin. So here we go. So heading for that pin, and I'm going to taper off really gently when I get there so that I just carry on stitching off the fabric. There we go. There's one dart. That just needs a press. I'm going to press it downwards towards the hem. There we go. You can always stitch that broad end to the side seam. So now the darts are done, we can pop this pocket onto the front. Again, I'm doing just one side. If you're doing both, then you need to do this on both sides, obviously. These are my marks that I transferred from my pattern, so I'm literally just going to poke a pin through those, through to the other side so that I can see. So I'm not going to damage the right side of my fabric. Plus, finding a colour chalk to show up on all those different colours would be difficult. So here we go, nice, quick, simple solution. So you can see my pins poking out there. So I'm just going to marry up those top corners to where those pins are popping through the fabric. Pin those down. Now the bottom corners. So this distance should be the same all the way down. You can always get your tape measure out for precision. So pinning that down, and then this other corner. And then that last bottom corner will naturally just fall into the right place. Okay, so I'm going to just stitch on the edge all the way around this pocket. You can always do some fancy top stitching or something if you want to get a bit more creative with it. Back tack to start. Careful you don't get anything underneath. And we're going to put the needle in and pivot around the points. So needle in, foot up, pivot the fabric, foot down, and off you go again. Same here. And again. That's it, that's all your corners done. Back tack to finish again. Just going to use my pin there to make sure that's exactly spot on. There we go. Little back tack to finish. That's my pocket on. There we go. As you can see, I didn't bother to pattern match. It's such a random pattern. There we go. Okay, so now we're going to attach the back yoke to the back. So this is my back, cut one and fold. Lengthen, shorten, these are armhole notches. There's a notch on the top there that you need to match to your yoke. This is a pocket notch. This is your tunic length, again suggested. And this is my yoke pattern. I've got a notch there and a notch here. Okay, this is also to the fold, and I've put little snips at the centre backs here which will help me with my gathering and putting my collar on. Okay, let's put the pattern over there. The first thing we're going to do is open this out, and you can see there's my notches that match my yoke and the centre back one there. So I'm going to do 2 gathering threads. So I've put my stitch length up to sort of 4.5, and I'm doing 1 stitch a centimetre away from the raw edge and another one halfway between the raw edge and that original stitch line, just for my gathers. And there we go. So now I need my yoke piece. I'm going to put these right sides together. That's my centre back notch, so I match that to the one I put on my bodice. There we go. Pop a pin in there. That's my first anchor point. Then I need to match my armholes. So squaring up the edges there and the other end. Okay, and then I've got these other notches that need to match too. I'm going to grab my bobbin thread and pull this up. Always easier to use the bobbin thread for pulling gathers. So it'll take me a little minute just to pull this up to the correct length so that they're both the same length, matching those notches. Fantastic. Pop a pin in there. I shall give those gathers a little bit of a manoeuvre when I'm sewing, when I come to sew them, to even them out a bit. Pull this up a bit more until we're the same length. Fabulous. So back tack to start, centimetre seam allowance right across to the other edge where you back tack to finish. I'm going to try and stitch directly on the gather line that I did a centimetre in. Okay, so matching those notches, and this is where I just kind of fiddle about with those gathers just to get them nice and even and lying flat so I don't get tucks. Matching up the raw edges. Okay, so that's my seam done. There are my gathers. I'm going to overlock this seam now. There we go, nice and neat. And I'm just going to give that a quick press up towards the shoulders. There we go. One yoke and gathers done. So next we're going to attach the front pieces to the yoke. So there's my back, right side up. And these are my fronts. I've got my centre fronts towards the middle, armholes off to the side. Just going to put a couple of pins in, match the raw edges. Okay, so from the neck out to the shoulder, centimetre seam allowance again. There we go. Give those a little neaten. Fantastic, they're both on, and I've just given it a little press. Let's put the facings on. So we've got just little front facings here. I've interfaced these with quite a light interfacing, and you need to notch the appropriate size. I've put mine here on that centre front, so I'm going to match those together, and I'm literally just going to do a tiny little seam from that notch down to the bottom. So back tack to start, centimetre seam allowance, and back tack to finish. There we are, just a tiny little seam. So we'll open that up. I'm going to press that open. I'm also going to overlock around this outside edge of the facing. There we go, you can see I've used a white thread so it stands out. And that's my little bit that's pressed. So now we need the dress. Let's try and lay this out so it's recognisable. So they're my centre fronts, and I want to pin this facing to the front of the dress down the centre front. Oh no, not that bit, this bit. There we go. So just to that centre front straight edge. Okay, putting some more pins in, and then I'm going to snip into that seam allowance where I started stitching before. That's the notch. So I'm snipping into that existing notch, but not quite to the stitch, because I'm going to need to stitch that centre front down, and this seam is going to have to match and meet with where that stitch is right there. Okay, so let's get this under the machine. So I'm starting at the top, I'm back tack, centimetre seam allowance all the way down, and I'm just going to stop when I meet that stitch where I started stitching the facing. And then I've back tacked. Let me show you that close up. There we go. So you can see that stitch line continues on. Okay. So I just need to trim down the facing side by half, just to reduce the bulk a little bit. Okay. So then I'm going to press that seam allowance towards the dress. Okay, so I've pressed the seam allowance towards the dress, and then I've flipped it over and I've pressed that edge so it's nice and crisp. Now basically all you have to do is exactly the same on the other side. So let's find our centre front. There we go. You can see my pocket there. So I want that top corner edge. we go. Just pin down that centre front again. And you're going to do exactly the same on this side as you did on the other side. Start at the top and stop exactly at the same point that you'd started that little tiny seam on your facing. Trim down the interfaced seam allowance by half. There we go. Press the seam allowance towards your dress and then fold it over and press it to get a nice crisp edge like we did the other side. There we go, that's your facing in basically. But now I'm just going to bag out these corners just for a nice little neat finish. So you just match it up to the shoulder, flip it over onto the other side, and you're going to stitch on your existing seam line through all layers, and then it will turn through like this and it will bag out that shoulder seam nicely. There we go. Straight across the same stitch line and just turn it through. Very neat. You can always hand stitch that if you can't get your head around bagging that out. And then I'm just going to pop a little stay stitch in this curve here so that it holds all the pieces together. So when we come to put our collar in on that collar edge, that it's just so much easier to handle if it's sort of as one piece of fabric. There we go, all stitched together. So there you go, that's your facing in. Just stitching down that other front neck. Fabulous. So the last little bit of this process, now we've got this facing in nice and neatly, is the front seam. You can see I've overlocked my front edge, and I'm going to pin from where that seam ended on both sides. I'm going to put a pin in. That's where I'm going to start stitching from. So popping a pin in there to hold those together so it's the same at the top and the bottom, it's right on that stitch. Let's move that over a tiny bit. So those are aligned, and I'm going to stitch from that point downwards, matching my notches. Let's pin it first. You can see my notches through my overlocking there quite clearly. There's another one, and there's the other one. So pop all those together, match the hems. Fabulous. So I'm going to start at that point, back tack, stitch down the centre front, centimetre seam allowance to the bottom. There we go. There's my seam. I'm going to press this open. So there we have it, a beautifully sewn centre front seam and a lovely clean facing. Let's have a look at it from the other side. There we go, that looks lovely and clean. Now we're going to prepare the collar. So you've got two different collars here. They've got alternating sizes on, so make sure you've picked the correct one for your size that you've cut out. I've got two. One I've interfaced, one I haven't. So top collar has no interfacing, under collar has interfacing. I'm going to lay these right sides together. You can see I've marked my centre backs. That will help when I'm inserting the collar into the neckline later. Match the notches, line up the raw edges, pop a few pins in. Okay, so then I'm going to flip this over. This is the uninterfaced side, so the top collar, and I'm just going to fold down my centimetre seam allowance and pop a pin in, and I'll stitch that down as I'm stitching around the collar edge. I just find that helpful when it comes to inserting the collar. So I'm going centimetre, and then I'm cutting across the corner by one stitch, and then I'm going around the rest of it. So we're starting at the edge, centimetre seam allowance, back tack to start, and I'm stitching into the corner, and then I'm going to leave my needle in, pivot my fabric underneath, do one stitch across the corner, pivot again, and carry on. This just allows a little bit more space into the corner for your seam allowance when you trim everything down. There we go, you can see my little corners there. So I'm going to trim down my interfaced side now by half. This is the under collar. I'll just do a little bit to show you. And then I'm going to cut across the corners, grade this little bit too, and just snip so that there's less bulk into the corner of your collar. And obviously cut all of it down, but just to show you this side, ever so gently tease out the corner. Fabulous. And then give it a press. Okay, so I've pressed my seam allowance up towards my interfaced collar from the inside, and now I'm going to just do some understitching. So through the seam allowance and the under collar, the interface collar, can't get right into the corner, which is absolutely fine, so just go as far as you can. But this will just help give you a lovely crisp edge to your collar and help it lie flat. There we go. So that's my understitched collar. Can you see the stitching there? Yeah, you can see that quite clearly. And then on the inside it looks like just two rows right next to each other. So now I'm going to give that a press. That's it, that's my press collar. So next we're going to attach the collar. Here's my dress. And you can see I've put a stay stitch around the neck here just to give it a little bit more stability when I'm pinning this collar on. This is my collar. And you can see the little notches where I put the centre back snip, which I'm going to join to the centre back of the dress. So start pinning there, and then I've got another notch on my collar. There it is, little snip there, and that matches the seam here. So pin those together. And then this is where folding back that little bit of seam allowance helps me just see exactly where I need to match my dress to. So that's exactly where I need to start stitching. Matching the raw edges together. Continue to pin. You can always do little snips into the curves if it helps. So again, there's my notch on my collar which matches the seam here. Pin those together. And match the front of my dress to the centimetre seam allowance turn back on the collar there. There we go, brilliant. So back tack to start, centimetre seam allowance all along, and back tack to finish. So I'm going to take this slowly, pulling those raw edges together so that they're on top of each other as I go. And we're going nice and slowly. Fabulous. Okay, so now we've gone all the way around the collar. Let's take a few pins out here. So that was my under collar, the one that's interfaced, which is stitched right sides together on the dress. I'm pressing that seam allowance now up. Okay, so my seam allowance is pressed up into the collar, and now I found my centre back notch there on my upper collar, folding down my centimetre seam allowance and matching that notch to the other notch. Give it a pin. Now I want to find the other notch on my collar, working my way around, folding back the centimetre seam allowance until I reach the one that matches the side seam again. There it is. Match it to that seam. And carry on for the rest of the collar. Try and lay it all out as flat as you can. Okay, that's all folded and pinned. I'm going to start at one end, back tack, stitch all the way around close to the edge now, just a millimetre or two from the edge. And I may readjust those pins a little bit as I go, keeping it all as flat as possible so I don't get any ripples in my collar. There we go, just pull that down a little bit more. Stitch carefully all the way to the end. There we go. Nice neat stitch line. Let's look at it from the right way round. That's it. Collar in. So next job is to put the pockets in the side seams. Again, totally optional. I've marked my notches with pen here so that you can see them clearly. There's my pocket. I've overlocked around there. I've overlocked my side seams already, and I'm just going to match the notch on my pocket to the notch on my side seam. Right sides together. Pop a pin in there and do the same for the other side. Remember, they're like elephant's ears, so they sort of droop downwards so you don't get your pockets upside down. Again, matching that notch, pop a pin in, and I'm just going to stitch down less than the 1 centimetre seam allowance. You want it to be inside the centimetre so that the seams don't show from the right side when you've finished making your pockets. So there you go, that's 1 and that's 2. So I'm going to press this seam allowance towards the pocket. Do that on this one as well. Give that a quick press. There we go. And then I'm just going to understitch right near the fold again, right near the seam. Just stops your pockets bulging out, keeps them nice and crisp and flat. Okay, so now we just need to stitch those together. So we're going to turn it right sides together. There we go, side seam. So there's a notch on your side back that matches your dart. Pop a pin in there and then pin down your side seam around your pocket. Make sure your pocket seams are lying on top of each other and pin to the hem. So starting at the top, centimetre seam allowance, back tack, stitch all the way down to your pocket. You're going to stay to the left of that seam there, that stitch line, go all around your elephant's ear, come out and start stitching down to the left of this seam here. Okay, so back tack to start, stitch down towards your pocket. So your needle is going to stop and pivot, and it's just to the left of that stitch line there. Pivot around and stitch all around your pocket. And then you're going to stitch over the pocket seams there, coming out just a stitch or two the other side of that stitch line. Leave your needle in, pivot, that's it, foot up, and then you're going to stitch down to the hem. Okay, there's your pocket. So all that needs to be done now is tidy up some of this nastiness here, and then I'm going to just clip into the seam and press it open. So I'll be pressing the top open, so I need to just snip into my seam allowance a little bit here, because the pocket will be pressed over towards the front. A little bit of a snip there, and then that will be pressed open as well. So here we go, you can see open, and I've pressed that pocket towards the front. There's my dart look, and then press the last bit open. Next job is to prepare the sleeve. So here's my sleeve. You need a pair, got notches front, back, top, don't forget your top one, and some fold lines here. So I've put little snips in to mark where these fold lines come, because you need to follow this zigzag line. This fold line's the really important one, so make sure you've got a way of marking that. So just need one of these sleeves for the moment. First job is to fold it up on that fold line I showed you and give it a press. Okay, next I'm going to just overlock that edge at the bottom. Okay, so that's the first bit of prep done. Then you can just sew your underarm seam as normal from the top. Pivot around the angles. Here we go. Stitching down to that first pivot, needle in, turn your work, needle in, turn your work. Oh, I pressed the wrong button, guys. So needle in, turn the work, needle in, and turn the work. There we go. So that's our sleeve underarm seam. I'm going to overlock that now. Nice and neat. So which way? That's back of my sleeve, so I'm just going to press this seam towards the back. There we go. Still got that lovely crisp line that I needed when we started. There we go. So fold it back on that line again. Pop some pins in. And it should lie nice and flat for you, which is helpful. And I'm just going to stitch just on that edge there next to the overlocking. Off we go. So that's my cuff sewn. You can see the seam there on the right side. Let's turn it all the way through. There we go. And then you just need to turn up the cuff. So that's a nice, easy way to do a little cuff turning. So I'm just going to even up that cuff width, and then I'm going to stitch through all the seams. So just in the ditch there, can't really see that very well, but I've stitched all the way through just to hold that cuff up a little bit, gives it a bit of an anchor point, and I'm going to give it a press. So there we go. That's one sleeve. Now we're going to insert the sleeves. So here's my dress, here's my sleeve. Now which side is which? That's my single notch, that's my front, so this must be my back. So I grab the underarm seam and pin it to the underarm of the dress. Match those seam lines up, pop a pin in, and then I'm just going to work my way around the sleeve, pinning as I go. So if you're not confident with inserting sleeves, there isn't usually too much ease in my sleeve heads, but if you're unsure, you can always run a big stitch around the sleeve head, the big curved bit at the top, and just gently pull it in a little bit, not to gather it, but just to help you ease it in. That's the top notch that goes to the notch on your yoke. And then you're just going to go around pinning evenly the sleeve head into the armhole. There we go. So I start stitching from the underarm and back tack to start, and then I'll stitch a centimetre seam allowance all the way around and back tack to finish. Here we go. So line up those raw edges as best you can, stick to the centimetre seam allowance as best you can as well. Your sleeve will fit in much better if you can be as accurate with that as possible. And just take your time working your way around. Okay, sleeves in, check there's no puckers or gubs, and then I'm going to finish off this raw edge with my overlocker. Always looks so beautiful when it's finished off, doesn't it? Let's check from the outside, make sure it's in perfectly. Fantastic. Repeat for your other sleeve. So the last job is the hem. Now I usually favour a very quick hem because it's the last thing and I just want to get it done at this point because I'm impatient. So I've overlocked and I'm just going to turn it up a centimetre and I'm going to stitch it. And I appreciate that if you've got the time, it is really beautiful to do a bias bound hem or a faced hem or something. It really does elevate things. But this is me just doing a quick hem. There we go. So that's all stitched. Just needs a press. There we go. Nice quick hem. So you should have now a dress with a collar, a facing, a pocket, two sleeves with cuffs, and a hem. And hopefully it looks something like this. Enjoy.